Good afternoon. And for those of us watching us on the live stream, welcome. And for those of you who are in the room who were here to watch the documentary, The Agreement, what a fantastic documentary that was. So well done and so inspiring. Welcome back. Again, it is a privilege to host such an extraordinary event and to welcome our guests from Northern Ireland and Queen's University, Belfast. I am Karen Arhimilo. I'm the Dean of the School and the Adlai E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. And I'd like to recognize and thank again Secretary Hilary Rodham Clinton, who holds appointments at both of our institutions and who is the reason we are together for this important convening today. It is really hard to believe that it has been over 25 years since the war in Northern Ireland ended. The conflict, known euphemistically as the Troubles, lasted 3 decades, pitting neighbor against neighbor and leaving thousands dead. The war ended with a peace that many had thought was impossible. The Good Friday Agreement was a remarkable achievement, proving the power of negotiation to resolve long-standing differences and end conflict. But in the story that so often gets told in textbooks, the peace deal was primarily the work of men. Most people know the names: Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, David Trimble, John Hume, George Mitchell. George Mitchell. But what about the women? What about Mo Mullen, whose diligent work as Secretary of State was central to building trust between both sides? Or Monica McWilliams, who is with us today and who was one of the few women at the table when the Belfast Treaty was signed. These and so many other powerful and courageous women were instrumental in bringing peace to Northern Ireland. And because of them, we are here today, celebrating over a quarter century of relative peace and calm. The evidence is clear that when women are involved in peace negotiations, the agreements are more durable, they're more inclusive, and less likely to break down. And the Good Friday Agreement is proof of what's possible when women are included at the negotiating table. We also know that peace processes do not finish with a handshake or signing of a piece of paper. They require long-term commitments to restore trust between two sides, to heal from the scars of conflict, and to rebuild from the rubble of war. Importantly, the Belfast Agreement also underscores for us the vital role of the university. As institutions like Queen's and Columbia, scholars have pored over the archives from the Belfast Agreement, which serves as perfect case study to understand war termination. And as I stand here today, one cannot think about watching the movie, watching the documentary, how difficult peace is, the courage that leaders need, and not to think about the Middle East today. And what are the lessons that we can learn from the Good Friday Agreement, from the negotiations, in terms of how we move forward in the Middle East? This is the work we do in universities, in academia, as scholars, and part of the work that we are doing here also in IGP. In the class I am honored to teach with Secretary Clinton, our students conduct a postmortem of historical case to understand crisis decision-making and psychology of leaders. And really, I cannot think of a better case study for our students or for today's practitioners and policymakers to understand then the Northern Ireland peace process and the importance of including women at the table. May we all learn from it. Sadly, so many of the challenges present in 1998 are still with us today. As we know, we live in a world awash in conflicts, and we still have woeful numbers of women in position of power. And that is a problem that we have to fix. And we have a lot of work to do. And hopefully, and I think in this school, as you may know, the majority of our students are female. And this should give also all of us hope. Resolution of present-day conflicts often seems remote, but peace in Northern Ireland also seemed like a distant dream. I know our conversation today will provide us with a deeper appreciation for all those who were vital to this outcome and give us hope for the possibility of peace. With that, it is now my honor to introduce Professor Sir Ian Greer. He's not only the president and vice chancellor of Queen's University Belfast, he's also an innovator and strong advocate of the role of university to promote social responsibility and instill in students the values and skills to be future leaders and peace builders. Please join me in welcoming Sir Ian Greer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Karen. I do hope you all enjoyed the documentary, and I hope also that it's not just something about the past, it's not just a historical documentary, but it does serve to put the context into place for resolving other conflicts throughout the world, which is so badly needed at present. I have to thank all our participants, some of whom have travelled a very long way to be here today. The afternoon promises to be really dynamic discussion and debate. I know many of the people on the panel, and I'm sure that will happen. There are really very many amazing women of influence in this room, women who've changed lives for the better, and I look forward to hearing from some of these trailblazing women this afternoon. But as I said earlier, it's important also to look forward. And one of the dividends of peace is to see the entrepreneurial spirit that's arising in Northern Ireland, with young people setting up their own businesses, ploughing their way through the modern Northern Ireland that we have. And so I look forward to hearing from one of our outstanding young entrepreneurs, Maeve Reynolds, later also. Now, just as you've heard from Columbia, Queen's is also committed to the cause of encouraging women from all backgrounds to become leading contributors to society and the economy. Just last month, Queen's became the very first university on the island of Ireland and only the second in the UK to achieve the gold level of a Distinguished Higher Education Award for Gender Equality. That's positioned our university as a leader in gender equality in the university sector. It's called the Athena Swan Gold, and it's a product of 25 years' hard work. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process, and we were led by Professor Karen McCluskey. You're going to hear from Karen a little bit later. However, over that period, we've improved gender balance across the majority of our roles and our grades, with more than 3 times the percentage of women professors than 25 years ago. We've made changes to working practices and patterns, such as enhancing our portfolio of work-life policies. We have a new menopause policy and a fertility treatment policy, for example. We're also committed to invest in a new Global Institute for Women's Leadership, which will improve access to higher education. It will showcase gender equality research, and it will launch international leadership programmes for women. But the work doesn't just end with that Athena Swan Gold Award. That award spurs us on to ensure that we are and remain a leading organisation for diversity, equality and inclusion. And finally, I'd like to close my section of the proceedings by thanking again our Chancellor for her exceptional support, not just during this visit to the USA, but throughout her period as Chancellor. We deeply appreciate your support. Thank you. Now, please let me pass over to our Chancellor, Secretary Clinton.
Thank you very much, Vice Chancellor. Again, it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you here for this day of events. And I especially want to thank the teams, both at Queen's and Columbia, who have done such a remarkable job getting prepared for this. And it takes a lot of work, so we are very grateful to all of you. It is a pleasure to have this affiliation that I'm honored to have, both with Queen's and with Columbia, two extraordinary universities, and two places that are committed to doing all that each can to further the cause of education, but also to be very active in the world around the walls of their respective institutions of higher education. Queen's, for example, as those of you who saw the film and know more about the history of the Good Friday Agreement understand that the university played a central role in the peace process in Northern Ireland. I was thinking as I watched it that first time I went to Northern Ireland was in 1995 with my husband to see whether, to sort of test the waters, whether there was any appetite for the United States playing a role in trying to bring the parties together for some negotiation. And we had the great delight and honor of turning on the Christmas tree lights at the City Hall in Belfast in front of an absolutely enormous crowd, hundreds of thousands of people who had turned out, many with their small children on their shoulders or in their arms, which said more to me than anything could about their hopefulness. And we stayed in the part of the Europa Hotel that was not currently bombed, and it was quite an experience to show up at the hotel we were staying in and see about half of it boarded up because it had been recently bombed. And I knew that the White House had tried to persuade my husband to stay somewhere else, and he said, no, we're going to stay in the part of the Europa that's not bombed. So it was quite an introduction to Belfast and a beginning of a very important relationship, certainly in my life going forward. So now we're about to hear from people who are both going to talk about their specific experiences as part of the negotiations leading up to the Good Friday Agreement, and then what has happened since. Those of you who saw the documentary saw the incredible difficulties that faced politicians and public officials and ordinary citizens to try to come together. In the words of Jonathan Blair, who was then Tony Blair's chief of staff, who was in the film, the talks advanced, he said, in an atmosphere of great hatred and little room. And so the peaceful outcome that was reached, and that we still thankfully live with today, was never guaranteed. It was the result of extremely hard, patient, frustrating negotiations that literally went on for years. And I'm especially pleased, as Surian just said, that women found themselves at the table at the end to be part of hammering out an agreement, and then, as some of you will hear from our panelists, to be part of governing afterwards. It's only recently that the world has woken up to the vital part that women play in security and peacekeeping. For many years, women's roles in the great events of the world have been overlooked, erased from history books, or literally never put in the first place. And so many women in Northern Ireland of the past and the present exemplify the roles that women have played. And many of those women's names are not known, but they were instrumental also in helping to change the conditions that created the environment for peace. Now, before we begin our first panel, which is made up of some of the key people involved in the peace process, we're going to watch a short video to set the stage to hear a little bit about the role of women in peace building in Northern Ireland. And I think it's important to underscore that centuries of institutional discrimination against women on all sides, this was, if the one thing the parties agreed on, it was that women had no role in the negotiations. It didn't matter whether you were Protestant or Catholic, Unionist, Loyalist, Nationalist, whatever you were. It just never either crossed your mind or there was an active opposition. And so it was up to the women themselves to come to the forefront, and they did again on both sides of the conflict. So I think you'll also see, too, that these women were not satisfied with just being at the table. They had an agenda about what would be left out if they were not the ones to champion its inclusion. And we'll hear about that as well. And I'm also proud to say that in my role as Chancellor, you will see and hear about how Queen's has made significant strides in its own journey toward equality as the university enters its 180th year. So let's take a look.
Since 1845, when Queen's College, later to become Queen's University, opened its doors in Belfast, the world has changed utterly. And that transformation, both in terms of the university and the wider world, particularly in politics, is perhaps best illustrated by the journey that women have undertaken within our campus and in our society. For the first 33 years, the new college in Belfast had men-only enrolment, and it wasn't until 1916 that the first female academic was appointed. There were other pioneers along the way, including the Riddle sisters, who established the first halls of residence for women in 1913. Their legacy is now known as Riddle Hall and is a major conference and event space on the university campus. Fast forward to today, we have Hilary Rodham Clinton at the helm as our Chancellor. A former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, is a former Pro-Chancellor of the university, and many of our academics and senior management are women. This remarkable turnaround didn't happen overnight, but its journey was recently recognised when it became the first university on the island of Ireland, and only the second in the UK, to receive the prestigious Advanced Higher Education's Athena Swan Gold Award. It positions Queen's as a leader in gender equality in academia, an influence that goes beyond the sector. The award is the result of 25 years of hard work, with more than 3 times the percentage of women professors today than in 1999. The university has ambitions to reach 40% by 2030. And the ambition doesn't stop there. The university is committed to an ambitious plan to continue its sustained and long-term approach to gender equality, which will improve access to higher education for disadvantaged schoolgirls, showcase gender equality research across Queen's, and launch international leadership programmes. This advancement in gender equality has been mirrored in the political sphere throughout a similar time span. The traditional view of a woman's place in society had kept them out of elected bodies since democracy was established in Britain and Ireland as well as across the world. But at the turn of the 20th century, women increasingly became involved in work that was seen as traditionally male, such as teaching. The more females became successful in professions previously felt to be the fiefdom of males, the more questions were raised in relation to women's exclusion from politics. And the first female MP at Westminster was finally elected in 1918. From 1888, women could vote in many local council elections. But it was 1929 before women were able to vote in a UK general election, after the first 3 decades of the century had seen the rise of the suffragette movement in the UK. The picture in Northern Ireland was even more bleak. A total of 9 women were elected to its government in Belfast in the first 51 years, with never more than 2 women out of the 52 MPs serving at any one time. Coincidentally, 4 of them were elected by the then Queen's University of Belfast constituency. Women continued to make their voices heard sporadically, despite the many hurdles they faced, notably the civil rights campaigner Bernadette Devlin, later McCalliskey, who became the youngest MP in Westminster in 1969, at just 21 years old. The Peace People were founded in 1976 and were led by the Nobel Peace Prize winners Mairead Corrigan and Betty Williams. But it was the formation of the Women's Coalition 20 years later that made the most significant and lasting impact. There was a distinct lack of female representation in the main political parties striving to end the almost 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland. A group of women led by Monica McWilliams, Avila Kilmurray and Brona Hines formed the party. They believed that women could set aside ethnic and religious difference and unite under gender solidarity to make a real difference in Northern Ireland. What it lacked in representation in terms of elected seats, it made up for in influence and played a crucial part in attaining the Good Friday Agreement. Senator George Mitchell, credited as one of the key architects of the peace process as he chaired the talks between the political parties, described the Women's Coalition as professional, prepared, and having made an enormous contribution to the peace process. It was a view shared by another key woman, the British government's first female Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Mo Mowlam, who was also instrumental in bringing the violence to an end. In the years since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, considered to be the world's most successful peace process, women continue to be underrepresented in the political life of Northern Ireland. But almost all of the parties now have had female leaders, and the last two Northern Ireland executives, the government of the region, has had women in the two top positions as First and Deputy First Ministers. Like Queens, women in politics have come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. The lesson of Northern Ireland is that for peace processes to be successful, they must be inclusive. They must represent the diversity and the talent of all sections of society. Everyone must feel ownership of the process. The promise of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement was based on equality and respect. It is a promise that Queen's University is committed to delivering through teaching and research, through policy and practice, and through the opportunity and example of our leadership.
Thank you very much. And please, we'll have the panel join us now. It is such a great pleasure for me to be with these four women and to have this chance to ask them questions about what they have experienced and, frankly, also lessons going forward. And so let me introduce them. Kate Farron on the far end there is one of the founding members of the Women's Coalition. She is currently serving as Deputy Director of the OSCE's Conflict Resolution Center. And that's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And you have your hands full, I know. Baroness Arlene Foster is the first woman to have served as First Minister in Northern Ireland. You saw her at the end of the film there, and we're so happy that you're here with us, Arlene. Mary Harney, former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, very active in the peace negotiations and process, and we're so happy Mary can be here. And then Monica McWilliams, you saw her in this latest film. You saw her in the documentary we screened before. She was the leader and founder of the Women's Coalition, former Northern Ireland Human Rights Commissioner, and someone who has taken the lessons from Northern Ireland literally around the world, trying to help others achieve some kind of resolution of conflict. So I just want briefly to ask each one of you to take us back to the 1980s and the 90s, because it wasn't an easy environment for anybody because of the Troubles, but it was also challenging for women to assume positions of leadership. And each of you, you, Mary, in the Republic, the others in Northern Ireland, had to kind of forge your own way within parties, within constituencies, and the like. So let me start with you, Monica, because you were the one who, finally decided you had to do something about that.
Yeah, you're taking me back a long way now to the 80s and 90s. People ask, how did the Women's Coalition come about? And I say we didn't fall out of the sky, which many of the politicians at the table accused us of. Where did they come from? And I say we had pre-existing networks. And I think that's the message to women everywhere that I work, that they've been working together for years, but probably at the front line, unnoticed, as you said earlier, where nobody knows their names. And sometimes it's good to work under the radar. And the women actually found that they got more outcomes by working under the radar, not having their names up in big lights or being fired out into the media's headlights. And that's what we did. So we've been around, Hilary, for 25 years. And then the moment came. Mostly my work was on violence against women and girls. And most of us who came together in the coalition had worked across the interfaces and the peace lines on that issue, which is common to women, and that's why we need to have women at the table. Things happen to us that don't happen to men in conflict, and we deliberate differently. That's why we need to participate. That's why we need to be represented. And so when that moment came, the message I would say is prepare, 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 because you never know when it comes. And I was one of those women who carried my 2 little children down to see you in 1995. We walked 3 miles on that cold November night because we just knew after the ceasefires there was a different atmosphere. And I stood that night and I looked up at you making the speeches with Bill, and I thought, I hope that this moment something is going to happen where we will perhaps have peace talks. And when they were declared, we were ready. And that's how Kate was 26 years of age. And so when you and others here today said, pass the baton, that the next generation of young women take over. And last week on International Women's Day, I was actually in the Mandela Hall at Queen's with 150 16 and 17-year-old girls from Protestant and Catholic communities in Belfast, the Falls and the Shankill, and they were all celebrating something called She, supporting her empowerment. And to me, to go from the 80s to sit or to speak last week, to me that was an uplifting moment. The same uplifting moment as I had when you came to Belfast in 1995.
Oh, wow, that brings back a lot of memories. So, Arlene, was that similar to your experience in the work that you were doing, Arlene? When did you first get involved in unionist politics, and what was your path like?
So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's wonderful to be here with you again as well. And so my political nursery, if I can call it that, was Queen's University of Belfast Student Union, along with this lady, Kate Fearon. And so we are products, for good or for ill, of Queen's University in Belfast and student union politics, and that's where we began. And I was on the unionist side. I remember very well going to Freshers' Day back in 1989 and joining up to the Ulster Unionist Party and then becoming involved in student union politics. And frankly, I was the only girl. I still call myself a girl. I know that's not PC. But I was the only woman involved, really, in politics and unionism. And I think everybody on the panel would agree that unionism was even more conservative when it came to having female participation. So I was seen to be somewhat of an oddity. But I became the chair of the Queen's University Unionist Association, and then from that became involved in the mainstream political party at the time, and I became a party officer when I was just 24, which was a big deal in those days. I was the youngest. I think there were 2 females in the party officers at that time. And so Queen's did play very much a political nursery role for me, getting involved in politics, being involved in mainstream politics. And what I say to young people now, regardless of what their political opinions are, get involved in a party. You may not agree with everything that the party stands for, but change it. Change it if you don't believe it. Campaign to change it. And I think the Women's Coalition, when it came along, was basically saying we need more women in politics, and that became a catalyst then for more women coming along. And now it is wonderful to see so many young women coming forward, despite all of the challenges, and there are many, not least social media abuse and all of the things that go on in the online world. But I think the fact that we have so many young women coming forward now in all the political parties is a really strong piece, and I'm very proud to see that happening in Northern Ireland.
I love your phrase, political nursery. That's such a great line. And Kate, you also started out in politics in that political nursery at Queen's. And, you know, I don't think that young people, at least here in the United States, engage in, you know, political organization and representation at university like they used to. And, you know, it was a great training ground. I mean, people had to learn how to, you know, be persuasive, make a speech, put together coalitions. That seems not to be as prominent as it used to be. But tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and share with you today. And similarly to Arlene, yes, I was at Queen's University, was a student activist, but on a number of single issues. I was also the first generation of my family to have a third level education. I think something which was enabled by the act of UK politicians in 1944, the Butler Act, which also enabled the civil rights movements as well at one time. But we also got involved in reproductive rights, and this was something that Momolam, actually, we wrote to her and she wrote back and gave us some money for our campaign almost the very next day. So really important to have women in positions of leadership who were generous with their time and generous with their ideas and advice. And that's one of my very profound experiences with the Women's Coalition as a very young woman at the time. No idea was off the table, and everybody's idea was equal around the table, and that was very powerful for me. We managed to do a lot of things. We organised the first gay pride in Belfast was done in the early 1990s. And maybe just to give a little bit of context, at the time, we had the Students' Union, as you know, is on one side of the road and the university is on the other side of the road. And it was the case that the university building was a cold house for Catholics, and the Student Union building, very broadly, was a cold house for Protestants, for Unionist students. And when I was president of the Students' Union, we had we were in our boxes, and we were quite combative in our debates on the student council. And I remember one day I thought, we've got to try and stop this. And one day I organised instead of a debate, a workshop type element. And I remember Arlene coming up the stairs afterwards to me and saying, I don't know if you remember this or not, Arlene, but said, that was actually really good. We actually talked to each other and not at each other for the first time. So it was really an opportunity to reframe debate, to play with different formats, to have an understanding of how important process design is in building relationships and negotiation. And those are things that I was able to take with me into the coalition. So very much.
Oh, I may want you and Arlene to come to Columbia and set up some processes so students who have very strong different feelings can actually, if they're willing, spend time together. Because, you know, it is a very challenging moment right now in higher education here in the United States. And, you know, there is a lot of talking at or yelling at, not talking with and listening. So I don't know, you both may have to give us some ideas here. Mary, your route to politics was a little different because you were in the Republic, but you ended up as the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister, as I said. Were you the first woman in that position? I don't remember. I think you were.
Yes, with Bertie as Taoiseach. My route to politics was very similar to Arlene and Kate. I went to Trinity College in Dublin. I joined the Fianna Fáil party. I also got involved in debating, the debating society, and that's where I first came in contact with a lot of people from Northern Ireland. In those years, Trinity had 5,000 students, and 20% of them came from Northern Ireland. And I remember it was the first time I ever heard people talking about TAGs and prods. And it was a real eye-opener. And I had friends from both communities, and through those friendships and through going to Northern Ireland, I took a great interest in it. But I was an accidental politician. I was appointed to the Senate in 1977 by the then Taoiseach, who can appoint 11 people. Because in those years, if you didn't come from a political family as a woman, you had no chance of being elected. So in Leinster House at the time, in the Dáil, I think there were 7 women. 5 of them were widows. One was the daughter of a previous male occupant. The widows were widows of people who'd occupied the seats, and one was a granddaughter. So I had intended becoming an accountant, but I got appointed to the Senate. So I was one of those lucky ones that was in the right place at the right time. And then roll on the years, you know, when I looked to Northern Ireland over those years, there were so many false dawns and flashpoints. There was, you know, the Sunningdale Agreement, and you were all excited this might be it. And then there was the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which I voted for, which led to my disconnection with the Fianna Fáil party. And then there was the Downing Street Agreement. And, you know, there was so much disappointment. And in fact, as Taoiseach and Deputy Prime Minister to Bertie, I actually said to him once, and I think this is a good place to say it, he was spending so much time in Northern Ireland. I said to him one day, all his weekends, they are impossible up there, you'll never get an agreement. And what it proved to me was that if you have the patience that he has and the negotiation skills, and you really stick at it, even the most intractable problems can be solved. And I think there's a great lesson in that, because people like me and many of us thought, you know, no offence, but they are so difficult. They are just so difficult. You know, it's so refreshing to see what's happened since. And, you know, I was just reading in the context of today, the investment in the tech industry is up 4.5%, farm industry 2.5%. Citibank went shortly after the agreement when there was peace into Northern Ireland. They now employ 3,500 people. Trade between 2 parts of the island up 60%. You know, even good business decisions weren't made because of politics. And I was talking to Alison from Tourism Ireland, and she tells me now, instead of 1 in every 10 Americans visiting Northern Ireland, 1 in every 5 or 6 Americans want to go to Northern Ireland. I remember a time in my relations with come from Chicago, and on one occasion we took them to Belfast and we didn't tell them where we were bringing them. And when they discovered, as we saw the signs, they said, "We're not going to Belfast, are we?" And I said, "Yeah, we're just going for the day." But they were terrified. And they were terrified to tell their folks back home where they were going. But now it's part of the agenda, and that the normalisation of life. I find we go to Belfast socially more often. People from Belfast come to Dublin. You know, you meet them in restaurants, things that never happened. Life has been normalised, and it's been absolutely terrific. And great credit is due. I wasn't a negotiator, by the way, and when I was invited here, I said to Ryan Feeney, I'm a bit of fraud because it should be Liz O'Donnell. He said, no, we want somebody that was in the government in the south, because the negotiations were done by other wonderful people who had patience. And the one thing I'd say about those negotiations that led to the success, obviously bringing in the paramilitaries was very important, as we now know, but creating that big space where both sides can be accommodated. And I think one of the things that women are good at, and Bertie Ahern has this feminine gene too, is listening to the other side. Because as George Mitchell said when he came first, somebody said to him, you know, we travel 100 miles here to insult each other. And he said he found that to be true. And people didn't listen to each other. And I think that capacity to listen to the other perspective forms the basis of sufficient trust. You don't have to love people to work with them, but you do have to have sufficient trust to make things happen. And I think the big learning from the Good Friday Agreement, as opposed to all the things that went before it, was the building of that trust, the bringing people in, the doing things that were almost unthinkable. One of my colleagues in our party was a former leader of our party, and he was a Minister for Justice in Ireland in the early 70s when things were really bad. And he had to bring in very strong legislation, the Offences Against the State Act, it was called, against paramilitaries, the IRA. And he had to move every 2 or 3 days. He couldn't stay in the same place. He had to carry a gun. His family were often moved from their house because of bomb threats. He was married to a woman from Oma. Her father's business was blown up twice. And I had to go to him and convince him that part of voting for the Good Friday Agreement was the release of prisoners. And when I watched the film, it brought all that back to me. It was so difficult. I mean, he didn't want to know about it. He didn't want to. His experience was such that it left a terrible, what would I say, legacy in his head, that these evil people could possibly be released. Now, the murderers of Jerry McCabe, who was a part of his security, they weren't being released, but they were very difficult decisions. We'd sit around the government, the Minister for Justice would bring names, and we'd all have, you know, you'd have to kind of adjust your critical faculties and kind of swallow deeply to say, okay, we'll go with this. It wasn't easy. So making peace is not easy. It wasn't easy in Ireland, but my God, is it worthwhile.
That's a great way to say it. You know, part of the reason we wanted to do this panel was to make the point exactly as you just did, Mary, that it's really hard. I mean, who wants to sit in a room with people who have killed people you know, have bombed places that you remember? Who wants to do that? And it takes an extraordinary amount of not just personal fortitude, but a sense of courage to take that risk. And Monica, I want to ask you and Kate particularly, what did it feel like to be in those peace negotiations? You know, they'd been going on. I mean, George Mitchell once said that, like, for the first year, if he could get, you know, people into the same room, that was a miracle, and then they wouldn't talk to each other. And if they said anything, he had to repeat it like they couldn't have heard it because they wouldn't hear it from the other side. So, I mean, give us a flavor of, first of all, how did you get in the room where it happened, and what was it like?
Well, we had 6 weeks to get organised, and we had, as I said, looked at who was going to be at the table, and generally who goes to a table. It's the armed groups or the constitutional parties. Very rarely does anyone from civil society get to a table, and generally it's women in civil society who have been trying to bring people together all over those years. So we made a decision after the ceasefires and after the Downing Street Declaration that we would put it up to the parties to see if they were going to put women delegates. They didn't answer our letters. So we said, right, we'll scare the life out of them and form a political party, thinking we'll never get elected, hoping and praying, because this was a baptism of fire for us. And I met Carmen here, who's down there, from the Trade Department in the States. And how that came about, I said, we're not negotiators. And we brought her all the way over she was dealing with bananas, I think, and trade. And we said, teach us how to be negotiators. Because if we're going to get into this, we need to know how to do it. Well, we entered, we got elected after 6 weeks. And I looked around the table and realised Carmen should have been training every other party, because they didn't know how to negotiate either. Because you bring problems. And when I sat down that first day, I looked around the table. First, we were the only women at the table. There were about 70 people in the room. And I said to Pearl, who was elected with me, I was Catholic, she was Protestant, I'm so glad that we did this. This is going to be difficult. And I looked around, and there was hardly a person in the room who hadn't lost someone. So little wonder George Mitchell said what he said, because we dealt with our hurt and our harm. What you get is a lot of feelings and a lot of bad behaviour, a lot of shouting. And then we got eventually down to business. I was just reflecting at Queen's, it was 50 years ago this May, on the 20th of May, when my boyfriend was murdered. From Queen's, we were both students. And then I thought, this is why we're here. Because if we're not going to negotiate, then there are going to be more and more and more deaths, an eye for an eye until we're all blind. And I guess when I look at what's happening in the Middle East now, that's exactly what I think. You don't get to pick your negotiating partners. You negotiate with people who've killed your loved ones. And that's what we did. We sat at that table, and I could see for the Ulster Unionists it was really difficult. Because as Reg MP said, how can we negotiate when there's someone still pointing a gun at our heads? And of course, we realised that prisoner releases were going to be part of it. And I'm glad the Women's Coalition were there, because we would never have had a word on victims in that section. And I want to pay tribute to Columbia on this. You may not know this. University of Columbia had an institute called Transitional Justice. It was one of the first. And we sat down and read what they had been writing about. And that's how we got sections like that into the Good Friday Agreement. So well done, University of Columbia. And it also taught me the importance of bringing other good evidence. Last night we heard this about evidence-based. And when we were getting close to the end of the agreement, we kept thinking, what else can we bring to this table that's not going to be on the table? And you saw that film, most of the discussion was about guns. And I remember at church, as I drove into the negotiations every morning, a church outside saying, let them rust in peace. And I thought, that is brilliant, but it's not going to just happen like that. But what else do we need to do? And I used to say, not all arms are imported, because most of it was up here. And that's what we also had to change. So for a year, we did nothing but vent and blame the other side and point the finger. And we were called a lot of names, traitors, a lot worse that I couldn't repeat here. And as you know, I wrote a book about it, and I could only put in the book what was on the record, because I figured I'll get done for defamation if I really tell what happened. So it was a very, very toxic, very difficult environment. But I remember my mother's words, and Mary has just said it, to start listening. And that's what the Women's Coalition did. We mediated, we facilitated, and we negotiated. And my mother kept saying, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that proportion.
Great. Kate, what was your experience?
Thanks. I mean, I think maybe I would add, we also did get really frustrated, including with Senator Mitchell, because we would go to him and say, you know, Ian Paisley in particular would orate for hours inside the talks and take a break to go out and do the same thing to the cameras for this 6 p.m. news in the evening time. And we were like, why are you giving him all this space? But it was that year of venting and getting it out and building that trust with, such as it was. I mean, at the end of the day, it wasn't enough to keep him inside the talks. But I always admired how Senator Mitchell really chaired. And in the February-March time of 1998, he also organised a series of small dinners between parties. He was interested in the idea of commensality, of breaking bread together. And I remember one meeting, Monica couldn't go, so I was there with Jane Morris, and the Ulster Unionists were our dinner companions on that particular evening. And I said something that I thought was self-evident about unemployment rates for Catholics in Northern Ireland, which had been a real socioeconomic issue. And David Trimble just completely lost it. There's like 6 people around the table. There's Mitchell's aide, and me, Jane, and I think might have been Reg Empey along with David that night. And for me, it was a real wow, because for me, this is a fact. I think it was indeed a fact, but for me it was just being in that kind of proximity and understanding that things which I believe are self-evident are not necessarily self-evident for the other person, irrespective of, and having to move that distance, because I think that one thing that we all agree on now, I would believe, is that David Trimble travelled the furthest of everybody. It was a hard road for him, a hard road for everybody. But I think he took the longest way. But having Senator Mitchell set up those small, intimate gatherings, those dinners, where we learned to know a little bit more about each other as well. And Monica, in fact, did the same thing in her house. She hosted places. So for us, it was really about building relationships so that we were able to punch above our weight. And I think that one other thing that I would note is that we really used optimism and a positive approach as a kind of political commodity in the process, because a lot of the time people were talking down the process, and I don't mean in a Pollyanna-ish way that we looked at everything through rose-coloured glasses, but having that sense of the possible really helped make it probable at the end of the day, so putting it all together.
That's really an interesting point that you make, and it's something that every negotiator, really everybody, should remember. What is self-evident to you may not be to the other. And Arlene, you were in the middle of a party, unlike Monica and Kate, who went out and formed their own political institution. And what was that like for you? And at the end, as we saw in the movie, the decommissioning and the prisoners were just a bridge too far for you to feel comfortable accepting. So reflect a little bit on that for us.
Sure, yeah. So I was there on the Monday, Thursday into Good Friday as an officer of the party, where all of the officers were there. And I think most people know my backstory. My father was the victim of an attempted murder. I had been blown up in a school bus. There were a lot of issues there in terms of IRA violence and having to move home when I was 8 and all of those sorts of things. And I was in a community that really, in terms of the prisoner releases, I was at National Presbyterian in Washington on Sunday, and I was listening to the prayers, and it was about peace with justice, and it was obviously talking about what was happening in the world today, and I was reflecting on that in terms of what happened in 1998. And for a lot of us, we felt there was peace without justice because people were being allowed out of prison. A lot of those people went on to become elected representatives. And then when I became the leader of the DUP and First Minister of Northern Ireland, the Deputy First Minister was Martin McGuinness. And for people to see me going into that role after me voting against the Belfast Agreement, I had said to myself, these people are now, they have moved away from violence, they have supported the courts and the rule of law, they have supported the police. We asked them to do that, and when you ask people to do something and they do it, then you have to respect their mandate and respect that he was elected as the chosen person to be the Deputy First Minister from Sinn Féin. And that was difficult. And we've talked about all of this being difficult and hard. And so I had to pull on my resilience, my own resilience, because I did lose friends as a result of that. And when I went to Martin McGuinness's funeral, people were very upset about that. But I felt it was the right thing to do, still believed it was the right thing to do, because I had served with him as he was Deputy First Minister, I was First Minister, in a joint office. And it was to respect him, his family, and indeed the community who had elected him. So it has been, over this last 25 years, somewhat of a journey. I don't regret the decision I took in 1998, because for me that was the right decision. But I also recall on the issues, and Jeffrey Donaldson reflected in the movie as well around this, that David Trimble had achieved a great deal in terms of consent. He had achieved Articles 2 and 3 were put to the people in the Republic of Ireland and were repealed. But for us, there were some things that weren't dealt with at the time, and Monica has talked about victims' issues. We know the issues that still remain on legacy issues in Northern Ireland. And the decommissioning issue hung around and caused great difficulty for David Trimble, as we know, during those coming years. So the process has developed. I'm very pleased it has developed, and today we have 2 females leading Northern Ireland again, and that is really good to see, and I'm very pleased to see that. And I think it has worked its way through, but there are difficult moments in the process, and you have to make the decision that is right for you and right for your community.
You know, I remember when you went to Martin McGuinness's funeral, and I really was impressed by that decision, Arlene. That was the right thing to do, and you just, you know, put your shoulders back and did it. And of course, those of us who watched Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness work together, I mean, you could not believe it. And they came on a trip to the United States, and it was truly like the, you know, Ian and Martin show. I've never seen anything like it. The two of them were finishing each other's sentences. They were telling jokes. I mean, it was impossible to imagine that just a few years before. And part of it is building that trust, working together. Now, we have to stop, but Mary, I'm going to give you the very, very last word. So from your perspective, what are the lessons that can be learned from looking at the agreement and listening to these 3 women who were so much a part of it?
Well, the first thing I'd say is being prepared to listen to the other side, because I think we all come from a bias or a prejudice where we don't understand why people see things in a different way. I was always very liberal on social issues. I could never understand people that were so intolerant, you know, and it's very important that we understand where people are coming from. That's the first thing. Secondly, to have civil society and women involved. You know, Monica mentioned, you know, highlighting the victims. When I looked at Northern Ireland as a young politician, it was all a sea of men. And when you look today at the Ukraine and Russia and Gaza and Israel, you know, you don't see any women. And I think the absence of women in civil society holds back the prospect of agreements, of peace processes and agreements. So the lessons are: be inclusive, listen, create a space that can accommodate everybody. And as Arlene has just said, you know, we all evolved to accept things we thought we could never dream of tolerating. I even found myself, if somebody had told me 5 years earlier I'd be in a government agreeing to release these prisoners, I would have said, sorry, not me. And you know, you have to be up for the difficult decisions, and that's what real courage is about. And I think David Trimble in particular, there's so many people that were wonderful. George Mitchell, I have to salute Bertie Ahern. You know, you were just, your stamina and your patience was just remarkable. And you know, selling in the South, particularly for the leader of Fianna Fáil, the removal of Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution, we shouldn't underestimate how difficult that was, believe it or not. We all look to the North and what they had to do and what the Unionists had to swallow, but there were difficult things. And after the agreement, I had the great privilege of working closely with Reg Empey as the industry minister in the North, and we went on a joint trade mission to the US, to Washington. And I remember, you know, it was just remarkable to see the interest companies had now that we had peace. So if there's any lesson to be learned, is there's a huge economic dividend, the normalisation of life, the improvement in the quality of life. We shouldn't underestimate that when people aren't frightened because of violence. The work on the ground of so many women's groups, the Falls Road, the Shankill work, you know, the work that you, Monica and Kate did, all of these things played a part. So my advice is bring everybody in, listen, have as much patience as possible, get somebody with the kind of skills that George Mitchell have, and my God, they're not easy found, to chair it, because that man put up with 3 years of really a difficult time. And you know, to hear him in Belfast last April talk about his experience, it was in a remarkable speech, probably the best speech I've ever heard. It was just remarkable, but we owe him so much. So they're the ingredients. I know you're going to talk to Bertie later, but unlike many of Bertie's predecessors as Taoiseach, who had sort of a bit of an interest in the North, a bit of an interest in trying to get a deal, but obviously had to look after the South, because remember in the 80s and 90s we had mass unemployment and emigration. We were an economic basket case. But Bertie Ahern just decided, I'm going for this, I'm going to make it work. Nothing was going to stop him, and you know, a lot has to rest on his shoulders, I think, anyway, as the leader of the government, because I saw, if I hadn't been in the government, I wouldn't have realised just how much time he gave it. And we heard earlier about his mother's funeral. I was at his mother's funeral. He had just come back from the North. He was going straight back up. There are not many people that would give that kind of commitment to a process, and these are the things that work. So they're quite unique, but lessons can be learned. If we could do it in Northern Ireland, me having said they're impossible, then we can do it anywhere, I think.
And Hilary, I'd just like to say one final word is to show gratitude. And I think showing gratitude to you, to your husband, to all of you who are here from the United States, who were our friends and walked that journey with us, and to Milan and others in this room. That was almost 30 years ago when you started that, and you're still with us today, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very, very much.
Go this way. Go this way.
Now we welcome to the stage Karen McCloskey, the Director of Queen's Gender Initiative at Queen's University.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be joining you today, and thank you to the organisers for the kind introduction and the invitation. In 1998, you've heard, the Good Friday Agreement brought fresh optimism, and it sparked new ways of thinking. Many groups, you've heard from them, were empowered to bring about positive change in their area of influence. At Queen's, a group of senior women decided it was time to change academia. They challenged the university to tackle gender inequality, and they formed the Queen's Gender Initiative, or QGI, to advance participation and progression of women. Well, it is no longer 1998. The last 25 years have seen Northern Ireland transformed, and in this time, QGI has led significant change in Queen's, dismantling structural barriers to women's progression and improving our culture. In fact, QGI brought forward challenges and solutions in equal measure. As the number of female politicians increased in Northern Ireland over the 2 decades, at Queen's, so too did our female full professors, and you heard in the film increasing from 11 to 34%. We've achieved gender balance for lecturers, associate professors, and our senior administrative staff. We decided early in our journey that women did not need fixing, but universities do. So we introduced new policies to support people through the rhythms of life. These are more impactful for women, and yet they benefit all. We also ensure that women are empowered through bespoke mentoring programmes and promotions workshops. And those measurable changes in Queen's and our work supporting others culminated in us receiving the Athena Swan Gold Award. And this means we are held to an even higher standard. There's more work to do. As QGI looks ahead to its 25th anniversary, this initiative is going to transition to become the Queen's Global Institute for Women's Leadership. You heard in the video some of our ambitions. We will lead the strategy and delivery of gender equality programme at Queen's, and we will champion girls. We'll improve access to higher education, particularly girls from disadvantaged backgrounds and underrepresented groups. We'll engage with universities and organisations across the globe. We're going to share validated strategies. We're going to learn from others. We're going to share toolkits and our research. And we will deliver international leadership programmes for women. We want to change the world, as everyone does in this room, and in particular academia. Many young people's understanding of leadership is shaped through their university experience, and we have a responsibility to present diverse leaders. We must correct that gender imbalance at senior academic levels. When I was a child, the evening news was often too frightening to watch. But Northern Ireland has changed. You've heard so much about it, and so too has Queen's. Women have emerged from the shadows that was shown in one of the art pieces in the film. Women are now professors, managers, vice presidents, pro-vice chancellors and leaders. The new Queen's Institute for Women's Leadership will open later this year. It will be better with you. We believe that a rising sea lifts all boats, and we will progress further and faster together. So we invite you to partner with us in this exciting phase. Let's lead together. Let's leave a legacy for the talented young women and girls who will rightly take our seats. They'll redesign the table and the seating order for themselves. Thank you. Thrilled and delighted to be the first university on the island of Ireland and the second in the UK to receive the prestigious Athena Swan Gold Award. The Gold Award recognises sustained improvements over a long period of time in gender equality. Queen's has come a long way. When we first opened our doors in 1845, all of our students enrolled were boys. And today, we've come so far. Women are now in our classrooms, our laboratories, our offices, and in our boardrooms. And now we have our first female Chancellor, Secretary Hilary Clinton. We are really pleased with the progress that we've made, but we're not content. There's more work to do. In fact, our award has a 5-year action plan with stretch targets to take us into the next phase. This is a good day for all the staff and students at Queen's. It's a great day for gender equality, and there's much more to come.
We now welcome to the stage the speakers for our next panel, Women and the Peace Dividend.
Well, it's so terrific for me personally to be back at SIPA, but I can't tell you how special it is to be part of this wonderful program on the women peace builders of Northern Ireland. You know, as we've been all hearing, and many of us remember so well, the contributions are just breathtaking in terms of what happened and what continues to happen. But the coming across the divide, putting together a coalition, becoming politically empowered, getting to the peace table, putting issues on the table that never would have been brought up in the peace agreement. We saw that. Getting the referendum passed. Too often, you get the agreement, you're finished. No. Then you've got to get that yes vote. And they worked assiduously on that. And to this day, and I know this personally, they have never stopped, the women in Northern Ireland, continue to work on so many issues that remain. So it's a great lesson for all of us. And I must say that I've been sitting listening because for several years, we brought women from Israel and Palestine to Northern Ireland. And until it broke down politically in the Middle East, and we couldn't do it anymore. But they learned so much from all of you. And you continue to do it. You've been doing it recently with Ukrainian women. There's so much here that's been achieved, but the reasons for this panel is global perspectives. This continues to influence the world. And that's what we're going to discuss with our extraordinary panel. And Sir Ian, I want to thank all of you, excuse me, from Queen's, because the film alone brought back a cascade of memories. So thank you for that. I'm sitting here thinking also, how do we distribute it around the world? Because there's so much to be learned from it. And as an honorary alumna, I must say I'm extremely impressed by the commitment to gender equality. So thank you, Queens. So we're going to begin our discussion by going virtually to, some of you will see her here, some of you can look back, to Miriam Coronel Ferrar. She was the lead negotiator for the government of the Philippines. She was the first woman to serve as a chief negotiator and as a signatory of a major accord, and that was the Bangsamoro agreement that was reached between the government of the Philippines and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Miriam, welcome. We wish you could be here with us, but I hope you got a sense from the first panel of what we've been discussing and how much it reflects your own work. Miriam oversaw what was and is by any description an extraordinarily model peace process. It remains one of the best examples of integrating gender, of engaging civil society, and benefiting from very strong female leadership, both in the government, where there was a strong leader on these issues, and then Miriam's work as the lead negotiator. So Miriam, tell us, why was it unique, how was it unique, and what can we learn today from it?
Hi, Melan, and good afternoon to everyone. It's such a pleasure and honor to see all of you again. We are all we've all learned from each other throughout the decades, coming through very similar, difficult processes, but eventually got to where we wanted, which were basically comprehensive agreements that would provide that kind of a transformative solution to long-standing conflicts. So we know, of course, that in 1998, we already saw how the women there, through the Women's Coalition in Northern Ireland, actually made a big difference. And it really took some time when we sort of saw again women in action precisely doing doing this stuff, being part at that high level talks and really being part of the decision making. And that's probably what made ours unique, precisely because, at least on the part of government, we saw significant presence of women inside the room, around the table. So you would see, for example, during handshake moments, that definitely there were women doing the handshake and a lot of other women in the back who were all part of the negotiation process. And that's a big difference. In the usual photos you would see of such handshakes of where some settlements have been arrived at. So indeed, we did have several provisions, about 8 items spanning the different documents that comprise comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, pertaining to matters relating to representation and participation of women, and basically protection of their rights, specifically the rights to political participation. And we emphasize political because this is really where we see that kind of a dearth where women are basically so much involved in the economy and in society, but it's in the public sphere, in politics, where we see precisely that dearth. So we did see that getting into the document after some discussion about the importance of having this meaningful political participation of women in the new political entity that we were creating, which was an autonomous region in the southern part of the Philippines. And I would say that learning from experiences, just looking at other examples that preceded us, certainly including Northern Ireland, and I'm happy to say we're celebrating 10 years of the agreement next year. Probably on a very basic level, what made it unique is that we're still here. The process is still here. As we know, the data is really terrible insofar as how peace agreements have been sustained. In the 21st century, we expected more to happen, but unfortunately, we are not seeing that. And in terms of women's inclusion, even the recent data indicates that agreements that are signed every year, on the average, only 30%, 20 to 30% of them actually have provisions on women. So I think in that sense, we provided examples on how exactly provisions on women relating to economic matters relating to budget, funding support, their role in development, their role in peace and security, representation and participation in the political system. These are certainly some of the basic elements. And we know, of course, that the Colombia process really expanded the types of provisions some more, and several other processes that followed. Perhaps I can also say that another unique feature is the kind of mechanisms that we have set up. It was very important, really, when you're negotiating, you're basically looking at, of course, the substance and all that, but you in many negotiations failed to consider how exactly to be able to sustain the implementation. And I would say that we have a slew of mechanisms, including, for example, the existence of the panels, which are now called implementing panels instead of negotiating panels, that are there to troubleshoot every step of the way. A lot of intergovernmental relations mechanisms have also been put between the autonomous region and central government, so that even at that level of the actual governance, we see good coordination on different aspects of all the elements that are now being implemented within, across the range of powers that have been devolved. So all of these mechanisms, I would say, are very important, considering precisely that our implementation has been rather slow. We're still in a transition phase 10 years after. We're still decommissioning weapons and combatants, but what we can say is that no breakdown between the peace that has now been sustained between the government and the more Islamic Liberation Front has happened, and we're still there.
Wonderful. Miriam, I remember you telling me some years ago that when your counterpart, the rebel leader, realized he was up against a female negotiator, he said to himself, this is not a serious process, and was prepared probably then to walk out shortly thereafter. But as he got into the process, he saw just how civil you were, how inclusive you were, how you brought in other people, and then gradually women from the Islamic Front were brought by him to the negotiations, which had never happened before. So there's a lot to be said about example, and even in bringing people around who, as we saw in the film, may never have come around. But also, I think you're learning from Northern Ireland, Colombia learning from you. There is a process here that's extremely important. So we thank you for the great example, and Miriam is no longer negotiating and mediating because she's in the classroom. So maybe there's even more negotiating and mediating in that respect.
Well, actually, Milan, we put up a Southeast Asian women's group of mediators, and we're actually involved in a third-party kind of role, you know, not as the formal mediators, but providing precisely that kind of mediation support for some of the process, especially within the region here in Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. So that's what we're doing now, and that's the point that we're trying to build. This is something that we can do. I mean, we're women, yes, but yes, we're mediators, and we can be good at it.
Absolutely good at it, and you're proof of that. So thank you. We're going to turn now to Phoebe Donnelly, who was a senior fellow and leads the Women, Peace and Security program at the International Peace Institute. She's also an assistant professor here at SIPA. Phoebe, next year we're going to be marking 25 years since the United Nations Security Council adopted this resolution, 1325, which is on women, peace, and security, recognizing women have a critical role to play. Interestingly, that action by the UN Security Council came after the example of women's participation in Northern Ireland. But it has not fulfilled its promise completely. So I'm hoping that you can bring us up to date to see how this is all a continuum in terms of the policies surrounding the framework today and the enabling environment.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the fellow panelists who we are learning from and using to expand our calls for the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. So as was mentioned, Security Council Resolution 1325 was passed in 2000, and the goal of that resolution, part of the goal, was to increase women's participation in all aspects of peace and security. Since that initial resolution in 2000, we've had 9 additional resolutions, all building upon this. Most recently, in 2019, we have Security Council Resolution 2493, and that resolution calls for, and a reminder that these are binding resolutions on all UN member states to facilitate women's full, equal, meaningful inclusion and participation in peace talks from the outset. It also focuses on enabling environments for civil society, including women peacebuilders, women human rights defenders, to carry out their work independently and without interference, including threats, harassment, violence, and hate speech. So I'm happy to speak more about some of that later on the panel, but I want to take us to where we are today. We've heard some wonderful examples about women's inclusion and impact on peace processes, but unfortunately this isn't always the case. So at UN Women, they're trying to track through their Peace Tracker process the role of women in peace processes, and Track 1 and Track 2 peace processes from 1992 to 2019. And the data's pretty grim. So women represented only 6% of mediators, 6% of signatories, and 13% of negotiators. Some other ways that politicians and leaders have tried to bring women in have been through separate consultative bodies. So in Syria, there's the Women's Advisory Board that was created, and in Yemen, the Technical Advisory Group created. And we're unclear how are these bodies increasing women's participation. So I think we're left with a lot of questions, unfortunately, but I want to leave with the note that we have the frameworks to demand women's inclusion in all stages of the peace processes. We have 10 resolutions for 25 years of these resolutions, and we know women were working on this even before the resolutions. So the framework is there, but now we have to call for the political will. Men, women, all genders need to be seeing this issue as their own, because inclusive peace processes are more effective peace processes. Thank you.
Phoebe, talk a little bit. You had mentioned the safety risks that women, it seems, are incurring more and more. Can you talk through that and how it impacts all of this?
Yeah, we actually worked with researchers who looked at the Northern Ireland case to try to understand how does protection, we often look at women's protection as one issue over here and women's participation as a separate issue over here. But if you think about it, we all know they're connected. So the protection risk you face may inhibit your participation. And so we found in Northern Ireland a lot of accounts of protection risk inhibiting women from, especially young women, which we've spoken a lot about, from wanting to join politics, from being a part of the political process or wanting to leave. We also looked at Libya and women's experiences there and the protection risks they face, and we found very similar experiences and trying to understand the entire enabling environment that allows women to meaningfully, fully, and safely participate in peace processes. So we're really trying to add safe into that. So the refrain of full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation.
And of course, we're seeing that in the political process now as well. In fact, when we were in Northern Ireland prior to your last elections, several of the young women who were running for office mentioned how they had been tremendously attacked on social media, almost to the point where they were going to leave their politicking behind and just say it wasn't worth it. So we have to deal with this problem as an ongoing problem, whether it's in the peace processes or in women's political participation. Professor Marcia Henry. Marcia is here from Belfast, which we're happy to have you on the panel as well. She holds the Hilary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women, Peace and Security and Justice at Queen's University. So you have an expertise in peacekeeping, and I think we should discuss that as well as a very important facet of this overall consideration of the role of women in peace and security. You have a new book, The End of Peacekeeping. I hope it's not the end. Gender, Race, and Martial Politics of Intervention. So let's look at the gender piece, because I know peacekeepers are largely male. There have been serious efforts to integrate increasingly. We're not anywhere near where the goals have been put. There have been some single female peacekeeping units, which is not really the ideal. So it's a question of how do you make an integrative model work, given what inclusion represents, even in peacekeeping. And then there are inequalities that come out of the way male-dominated peacekeepers often relate to the host communities that they are providing security to. So talk about all of that, and then maybe the peace dividend also.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me and including me here. And I also want to extend thanks to Queen's for welcoming me, because I've just started this post in January. And, you know, I don't like to emphasize the stereotypical ideas of Northern Irish hospitality, but Queen's has been an incredibly welcoming community. So I'm so pleased to be here. And thank you to Columbia for extending that hospitality here. So I've been fortunate enough to be able to finalize, the book project while I've begun at Queen's. And some of the work that I've been doing in that book is to look at over almost 20 years of field work in peacekeeping missions and some of the experiences from both peacekeepers and what I refer to as the peace kept. I know it sounds like a very derogatory term, but I actually use it in order to situate the sort of unequal position that many peace-kept people, many beneficiaries of peacekeeping feel that they are in a sort of object role. And one of the things that's really come out is around, so I've been tracking and looking at the experience of these all-women squads. So in 2007, the UN welcomed the introduction of around 110 female peacekeepers from the Indian militarized police force, or the Central Police Forces, and they had their first deployment to Liberia in 2007, and then they subsequently continued to return, with these female squads. Now, in many respects, this had a great representational impact. Seeing 120 women in uniform, no matter what you think about the politics of women in the military, it's a very moving, it's very powerful. But then when you talk to these women and you find out what kind of challenges they are facing, when you hear their experiences, I mean, you're surprised actually at some of the experiences. I mean, one of the ways in which troop contributing countries actually, they both create these opportunities for women to participate, but then they also, impose traditional barriers. So many times these women would not be able to move freely in the peacekeeping mission. They would not be able to speak to other female peacekeepers, to develop, to speak about their experiences. So what I call, or what Cynthia Enlow refers to as the persistence of patriarchy, was still very much present. So while female peacekeepers were given these new opportunities and they had this symbolic impact, they were not able to experience the same freedoms that most military men experience in peacekeeping spaces. And civilian women peacekeepers and senior peacekeeping leaders that were women, they were able to experience some of these freedoms or some of these opportunities much more. Yeah. In relation to, I think what you were, implying in when you have a male-dominated peacekeeping force, which you have, or a male-dominated peacekeeping presence, I mean, you can just imagine in a small city like Pristina, you have 15,000 mostly male military troops arriving in the city. That's going to have an amazing impact on the communities. It's going to send a very clear message about, who represents peace and what kind of peace work can be done. So I think that there have been all these increasing initiatives by the United Nations, for example, to sort of root out historical problems of sexual exploitation and abuse. But again, if you think about going back to the experiences of the female peacekeepers that I spoke to, some of the barriers that they face in moving around the mission, in fully integrating with their male counterparts, you can see that those barriers, that persistence of patriarchal ideas persists. And I think, just to think about one other aspect of the expectations on female peacekeepers, especially military ones, we still have these very masculine norm ideas about how women in the military are expected to perform. So I was just thinking about a wonderful medal parade that I was able to observe and participate in, where this 120 female peacekeepers from India were congratulated by the SRSG of the mission and given these medals. And again, I said it was an extremely moving ceremony. But then these women performed these, as part of the celebration, they performed all these skills, these advanced weapon skills, and it culminated in a woman from the Indian contingent, jumping through a ring of fire to prove that she was just as capable, if not more, in that moment. And it seemed to me that those expectations and those standards, those still persist. And instead of us really looking at what ways women can make a significant impact in those missions, we're still expecting them to prove how they exceed masculine norms. Yeah.
Just like the end of the film, the journey continues in so many different ways. Unfortunately, as always happens with these panels, I'm told we have to close. But I can't thank our panelists enough, not just for what they've discussed today, but for your example, Miriam, and all you've done and will continue to do through the mediators, and to our two panelists here on the dais and the studies that they will continue to work through elucidating this issue in ways that needs to continue. I just want to say, I'm at Georgetown University at our Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. This week we launched the first ever conflict tracker with a gender perspective. So we're looking initially at 26 international crises, the impact on women, and then most especially, what are opportunities for intervention that have to happen to bring those terrible conflicts, in most cases, to a conclusion that really can make a difference. So hopefully that will be useful to everybody who continues in this space. Anyway, thank you, and it's always wonderful to be here. Thanks.
Now we welcome back to the stage Secretary Hilary Rodham Clinton, joined by Bertie Ahern, the former Taoiseach of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Henry.
Well, I have to say this is a particular personal pleasure for me. I've known Bertie for a while and really admire him as a person and as a political leader. And I think you got a bit of a sense why from the documentary this morning, because I think it is absolutely fair to say that there would not have been an agreement without Bertie as one of the absolutely essential players. You know, let me just start, Bertie, with maybe asking you to give a brief overview of your own personal history that led you to Belfast in 1998, that encouraged you when you became Taoiseach to say you were going to make this a priority. As we heard from Mary earlier, you had a lot of other things going on that you had to deal with in your own administration. But when did you hear about the Troubles? What did you think about the Troubles growing up? And how did you decide that it was, you know, your mission to try to bring them to an end?
I don't need a mic. I suppose I grew up in a house that was, nobody was elected to politics, but it was a very political house. Hilary, my father and mother would have been strong Republicans. You know, there would have been very much came through the Civil War, the War of Independence. They took, you know, the anti-treaty side in Ireland's history. And at the same time, you know, we had a good opportunity. My father's played hurling in Cork when he was young, and half of his hurling team were Protestants, which was very extraordinary. They were fairly big farmers, so he always you know, he believed in the philosophies of Woolton, that Catholic, Protestant in the centre, that you had to unify things to ever have a free Ireland. Of course, he would have been a very strong United Ireland person. So that's the kind of a house I grew up. So I probably joined politics more from being interested in community facilities and seeing the neighbourhood that I was in, to see opportunities, and very few people were going to third level. And to see that, you know, it was better jobs and better futures. So I was lucky. I was elected into politics like Mary. Both of us were in the same time, 1977, where our party did really well. So I was in Member of Parliament at 25 years of age, and spent 35 years in Parliament. So from day one, I had an interest in the North. The troubles had started. I was involved in debating competitions in school at second level and then third level, and when I was doing accountancy. And the North was always on the agenda. Students' politics in one angle or another was on the North. And you know, I just watched the troubles, the horrified of the troubles, where most of the troubles took place in the North, and most of the bombs and the terrible atrocities, and most of them took place in the South, were in my area. So the worst one, other than the Oma bombing, which you know all about because you were there with your husband, and that terrible occasion. But the previous one was the Dublin Monaghan bombings, which was in my area. So I had been involved with the families of that all the way through. So I think by the time I, was, and then I was Dublin based, so we were meeting the parties from the North, those that would come down. In those days, a lot of the parties wouldn't come down. It was all the nationalist side were coming down. And the SDLP, John Hume, I got to know John Hume really well, Seamus Mallon. So I was listening all the time to the debates and watching out. And then I watched us very quickly. I watched 1974, which was before I was in Parliament, and I watched that didn't work, even though I always say the people who were involved, they did their utmost. I don't think I blame any of the political people involved. They did their best to make it work. 85 didn't work, and they all did their very best as well. So I was always conscious that there must be something. Do we always have to accept that hundreds of people are going to be killed from political violence every year, and whether it was political violence or terrorism, it never seemed to matter to me. There were people who were being killed, damage done, damage to reputation. And when I was minister, I'd come over here, and we would say, oh, it's not too bad in the North the last few months. And then I'd come over here and people say, how's the war going? And I remember being in a church for St. Patrick's Day in San Diego, and there was a priest from Sicily, and he was saying the Mass, and he was praying for all the people in the trenches fighting the Empire. And I said, Jesus, is this where I come from? So I remember looking around at the ambassador behind me. The Irish ambassador was horrified, and I kind of thought it was funny. But I always believed it was something we could do. And I got to know all the parties. I made a point of listening to them all, and everyone has their point of view. And I think the important thing, Hilary, I know that you do this all your life, but it's to listen to their point of view. And no matter how off the wall it is that you think, that's their point of view. And I think that's how, and then I was so lucky that Tony Blair came in the same time. I was so lucky to meet up you and your hubby. You've given 30 years of this. You've been at this since you went into the White House. And it's been a good journey, but thankfully it's been a real success. I mean, the one thing we were saying this last night, I think, you and I could probably get out of a car in Belfast, and you know this because you're there so much, and walk around now in Belfast probably, and we'd be safer than we'd be in any other city in Europe. And that takes something from where we used to be,
Yeah. Bertie, it really strikes me that, as the film said, you and Tony Blair and my husband, you were all in your 40s, so you were relatively young, but you'd been each in politics for a long time. You know, you at 25, Tony Blair, my husband, you know, was elected governor of Arkansas, well, first an attorney general of Arkansas when he was, I think, 26 or 7. So you'd been in politics. And, you know, politics today, unfortunately, sometimes, you know, has a bad reputation. Like, oh, yeah, that's politics. But on the other hand, I think it wasn't just your youth and your energy, but your experience. You'd been in the trenches. You had to be elected to office. You had to negotiate inside parties with coalitions. So talk a little bit about, as you just said, you had to listen to people despite whether you agreed with them, despite even, as we heard from the earlier panel, you thought that what they were saying was rooted in evidence or not. You had to listen to them. How do you move to find some common ground when people start from such diametrically opposed positions? Because we need help on that right now more than ever. How do you get people to actually decide they're willing to find that common ground, which, you know, is what you have to do in negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I was involved in a lot with dealing with trade unions and employers and farmers in the early years, and you know, it's the same thing. You're dealing with professional bodies, or you're dealing with trade unions that are coming from, you know, blue-collar backgrounds. It's always trying to find where is the thread, where is the one item that perhaps they can all see. And you know, Tony Blair used to say, if we could get one single item they could agree on, then that was progress. So you're looking around for one single thing that maybe it was a common ground. And you know, sometimes you get that, but I think the old rule is nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. And I'm a great believer, if you try and do it and say, we've agreed that, now put that aside, it will not work. It's to try and say, well, we know that will work, but you don't say it. And you just try and keep going around and seeing all the bits. But in Northern Ireland, I mean, our ground rules, and you know this so well, but for the audience, it was to be as inclusive as possible, as comprehensive as possible. It was never maybe totally inclusive. We didn't get Ian Paisley on side on day one, but we did eventually in 2006. St Andrews Agreement, which is important. We always remember that, because that was important to get him on side eventually and get his party on side. And that's been a big success since. And then to be as comprehensive. And I remember in the early days when we looked at the issues, you know, the reform of policing, the reform of the criminal justice system, the issues that Monica was saying, you know, about how you deal with victims and the legacy and the issues that we're still battling with. You know, how do you deal with prisoners? How do you deal with decommissioning arms? And there were huge, huge items. And, you know, I mean, I think maybe we probably made a few mistakes along the way. And like, I always feel that if we had said, on prisoners, if we had dealt with prisoners the same as decommissioning, if I had it over again, I would have had the same rules. 2 years, and that was the period. Not 2 years, we'll do our best. And so, but there are always those things you could do. But they were all huge items, and they were all difficult items. And you know, I think the parties, the idea that everyone's going to agree to everything is just poppycock. You know, that never happened. But if you can see that the balance is reasonably fair. Now, there'll always be people. I mean, I used to love in Northern Ireland when people would say to me, yeah, but Bertie, you know, we agree with everything you've done, but leaving out prisoners is a step too far. Or the other side, if you get the guns, well, we can agree with everything. But there was, the other side weren't going to give that, so you had to try and get the balance as best you could. And I think, in fairness to David Trimble, you know, I always think he was wonderful, because a number of times he had to take them, and we left him down on decommissioning, to be honest, because if we had got decommissioned earlier, you know, it would have, his political career wouldn't have hit the dust. But as you know, he was happy in the end, and I'm so grateful that he, you know, he at the end he said he doesn't regret anything that he said. But if you look at the hardest issues, if you don't go for a comprehensive agreement, it's easier, but it won't be sustainable. And I think the reason the Good Friday Agreement has been sustainable is because we took all the hard issues. First person in the world to say we mightn't have got them all perfect on day one. but they worked their way through. And you know, because of all the people involved, and we've heard today with Arlene and Monica, and you know, Mary Harney was very kind to her remarks to me, but she gave me the time to spend in the north, and she wasn't the only one in the cabinet who thought it was nuts to stay at it. But anyway, I would have lost that vote. But anyway, but I think it's that, you know, just keep at it, keep at it, keep at it.
But you know, that takes a lot of sort of personal stamina, resilience. You know, you are so invested in something, and it's not making much progress. I mean, I think somebody referenced earlier the absolutely extraordinary speech that George Mitchell made last year at Queen's during the 25th you know, anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And he was very, you know, candid about what a toll it took on him, what a toll it took on his marriage, you know, having that newborn baby boy, which is referenced in the documentary, and feeling like, you know, I can spend time with my wife and son, or I can go and beat my head against the wall with, you know, people who won't agree on anything. So you really have to have a sense of personal commitment. It's not just political. And when you get to that last, 24 hours that was depicted in the film, what kept you going?
Well, I think the last few days, I mean, it's one very important point that maybe the film doesn't quite pick up, that George wasn't going to come back at all. And Heather, you know, the baby was born, and Heather kind of...
That's his wife. Heather is George's wife.
And Heather said to him, you know, you'll regret this. And he spoke to your husband, and they said, well, give it one more time. And he was serious. And I think the thing is, you know, that everyone knew he'd given this a lot of effort, and that when he said, I'm going to give this till Monday, Thursday, they knew he was telling the truth. And I think that's when everybody, you know, got off the stage and said, listen, we've talked this into the death. We know where we won't agree. We know where we will agree. And let's really give it the... What kept me going those last few days just was the thought that if we failed on this, the security reports were very clear. Now, I had the meeting on the Sunday morning when my ma had a heart attack, and I had a meeting an hour later, which I had to keep to. And I remember being in the, listening to the police, and I was thinking of my ma down the hospital, and then, by God, I focused very quickly when the police told me that all the intelligence from the RUC as they were then, and from the British side, was that if we failed, which we were likely to fail, this was Sunday morning before, that there'd be violence back on the streets by the weekend, which would have been Easter, which is a time Republicans have their commemorations. So that focused my mind for the week, because not alone were we going to fail in the process, and that would have been not good, politicians don't like failing, but if the headlines the following weekend were going to be more shootings, more deaths, and I think, but you know, your husband knew about that, Tony knew about that. I think it was mentioned in the film that they had some reports coming through from Davy Irvine, but we knew it from the intelligence reports, which are rarely wrong, and they were black and white, saying, hey, listen, you guys, and women, just in case anyway, if you mess up this week, the consequences are, and that's what kept me awake for three nights without, you know, being too tired. I just kept going.
Wow, that's a great motivator. If you think, we used to call them the hard men. If you think the hard men on both sides, the paramilitaries, you know, the hard men, the hard IRA men are going to go back to killing and fighting, you had a lot at stake. That meant that you really couldn't stop until you couldn't go anymore.
No, I think that was it, because you were going to get back into a cycle of violence. I think it was probably going to start with the loyalist side, but it didn't matter who started it, and then it was going to roll on. And then, like, I kept on saying to myself, I remember talking to some of my friends back in Dublin, some of my cabinet colleagues and Mary and others, and we said, Well, the trouble started in 68. 74, they gave it a shot. Nothing happened till 85. Now we're 98. What happens if we mess up? You know, where's the next stop? Long after our time. And I think that's, you know, that's why we all kept at it. And you know, you know, your Bill stayed up for that night, and it was 2 nights where you know, doing the phone calls, talking to it. And I think that encouragement and then getting people just to be a bit strong. And you know, and in fairness to Ian Paisley, I just wanted to, in case of Ian Paisley, I ended up great friends with them all. And Ian Paisley comes across a bit in the film that he was an impossible guy. Well, you know, in some ways they were all impossible except Monica. But you know, we got to a stage. But Ian Paisley, I always remembered, George Mitchell was making great progress with Ian Paisley at one stage. He was really making good progress until he turned up one day with his advisor. And he sat down with his advisor, and Ian Paisley, he says, who's this lady? And George says, Martha Pope. And he says, now you're bringing the Pope into this. Blew the whole thing. And poor Martha Pope, I think, was, I don't know what religion she was, but she wasn't a Catholic.
I know Martha Pope, and she was very...
She was brilliant.
She was brilliant. She was very effective. You know, I do think that it's important to look at the consequences of what the Good Friday Agreement has enabled. So I want to ask a young woman, Maeve Reynolds, to come join us. She is a founder and chief executive of a tech company, but she's also one of those young people whose lives were changed because you stuck with it, Bertie, because, you know, everybody who we've heard from and everybody who was in that film didn't give up despite the odds and kept going. And I like the sort of juxtaposition of Bertie, who was there helping to make it happen, and you, Maeve, who benefited from that. Now, how old are you now?
I'm 24, so I was born July of '99, so a year after the agreement was signed, which is, it's incredible.
When you were growing up, what did you hear about the Troubles or anything prior to your coming of age?
Yeah, so I grew up in West Belfast in an area called just outside Turf Lodge, and during the Troubles, that was a very, very turbulent place. The difference in my upbringing compared to my father's upbringing, who also grew up there, is just absolute night and day. So it's just so moving to be here and hear about all the resilience and dedication to making a better future for people like me. And I just want to express my utmost gratitude from myself and the community I represent of young people of Northern Ireland, because yeah, what a difference that made, and the amount of opportunity we had, and compared to our parents' generation. So it's absolutely amazing. So thank you very much to all the very, very important members that made that possible.
Well, thank you. So what's it like now living and working in Belfast? And you've started this company called Go Pluggable. So what is that?
So Go Pluggable is essentially, the best way to describe it, it's like an Airbnb for electric vehicle home chargers. So really we set out the company to make more sustainable lifestyles and sustainable mobility more accessible to everyone, especially people who don't have access to a private driveway to charge from home. So it's essentially creating a circular economy, bringing sustainability into communities and allowing the sharing of electric vehicle charging infrastructure through a simple mobile app. So that's the quick pitch, so to speak. Yeah, I started the company in my final year, studying at Queen's University. I studied a master's in mechanical engineering, and which was once, of course, a very male-dominated field, and still is to this day. But I really feel that during my time at Queen's, it was phenomenal. I had amazing academics who were women who really, really did everything they could to empower us and really teach us that we can actually go out and solve real world problems, and we are capable of doing it, and we will do it, and very well respected by my male peers as well, going through Queen's. And Queen's do an excellent job of really empowering their young entrepreneurs to go on and do great things and represent Northern Ireland and put us on the map, not just as innovators for peace, but also for tech, medical research, finance, the list goes on. So,
I love that because more than likely pursuing that kind of career in the early 90s, you might have had to leave, right?
Yeah,
you might have had to go elsewhere to start your business, create your own future. You know, I think it sounds like you're very hopeful for your future, for your business, for Northern Ireland. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, definitely. I think every female entrepreneur does have their own struggles as well. You know, the challenges are not just within Peacebuilding, but specifically, I know the British Business Bank recently did a report for venture capital that's invested in the UK, and less than 1 penny of every pound is invested in female-led businesses. So we have a long way to still come. And I think Belfast does an incredible job already of championing young women entrepreneurs. You have angel investment syndicates like Awaken Hub that are informing women of how to go and get funding for their businesses, but also empowering women that are successful to give back to their community. You have amazing innovation hubs like Catalyst. Of course, Queen's do an excellent job of empowering female entrepreneurs. So I'm very, very hopeful for the talent that Belfast and Northern Ireland has. And I really do feel like Northern Ireland has a special kind of grit, talent, character that is very rare to find. And we've always had that, even before the agreement was signed. It's just now we have the opportunity to really showcase it.
Well done.
Great. That's really great, maybe. So, Bertie, I want to wrap up with you because you know, you had such a varied political career. You tackled a lot of challenging issues. You see the world that we're in ourselves right now today, wars, you know, a war in Europe, which honestly we hoped would not be seen again, terrible conflict in the Middle East, a lot of conflict we don't even talk about in Sudan or the Democratic Republic of Congo, lots of people being killed, lots of proxy wars being waged by countries looking for power, influence, natural resources. We have a lot of challenges. So what would be your advice to this next generation of you know, leaders, diplomats, business leaders, others who, you know, would like to see the same kind of circumstances in all of the world that we now see in Northern Ireland? What can we be doing, or what should we be doing that we're not?
Well, if I could make 3 points in wrapping up, Hilary. The first one is, I think the one thing we all need to do, and particularly to the next generation, I say this in colleges all over the debating season this year, at home and abroad, we need to keep on fighting for democracy, because if we lose democracy, then we lose all the kind of political leaders. You've been listening to all the people who are involved, and whether we agree or disagree with people's views, but they've all Mary Harney has served as leader of a party in my government. Arlene has been First Minister. Monica has been in Sudan. She's been everywhere. Catherine, you've been in OSCE. I was with you in Vienna recently, and terrific people. But if we lose democracy, and we are in trouble. I mean, you see this weekend. I don't want to say anything about the sham election the other day in Russia, but you see the problems, and you see what's happening in the Middle East, and different parts of the Middle East. It's not just one. So I think we have to fight for the belief in democracy, because if we don't have democracy, we're going to have nothing. I think we have to try and keep on dealing with the conflicts, and we've just heard how women played such an important role. But there have been thousands of people being killed every day in different parts and different conflicts. I was involved in Papua New Guinea, and just thousands of people killed. Nobody hardly knows about it, and it's just horrendous. So I think we have to keep on people, no matter what organisation you're in, no matter what peace group you're in, or if you're not in any political movement, to try to play your role in that. First point. Second point, I want to make, I just saw all the people who were in that film today that are gone. It was a bit frightening. Every time I looked at the shot, and I said, God, she's gone, he's gone. You know, it's really, so I want to think of them all up there. They were all great friends, and to all the ones that are alive, the ones that are here, you know, to thank them for the role that they play. They all played great roles. And my last point is, Ireland is a small place. Ireland of Ireland is a small place. You were First Lady. You and your husband were the most important people in the free world, and you gave your time for 30 years to our little place. Thanks.
Well, I could not be, you know, more grateful to have been able to be part of the events today because, you know, we all need to be encouraged and we need to be reassured, but we also need to be challenged that there are many more things we all could be doing to try to make a difference and to try to be, as best we can, peacemakers and peace builders. So as we bring this day to a close, I really, again, want to thank Sir Ian and the entire team at Queen's. I'm so proud to be associated with all of you and really excited by everything you're doing and the new you know, Global Women's Leadership Center. Karen, I can't wait to hear more about that and see how I can be helpful and how we can partner. And to my dean and partner, Karen, thank you so much for your inspiration and leadership in starting the Institute of Global Politics. I think now more than ever, universities have to be places where we can have conversations about what happened, understand what happened, learn from what happened, and then try to figure out what we can do now, and do it in a way that brings people together, not further divides us. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for making it possible for us to believe that there is a better way forward. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.